A properly planned laneways allow for movement of animals among paddocks without going back through a paddock which has already been grazed. And laneway construction is very, very important, particularly for dairy cattle, because in times of wet weather, when animals are concentrated in laneways, it can get very muddy and very dirty. And properly constructed laneways are very, very important to prevent mud from getting on cattle's udders, and also for udder health and their feet health and the prevention of mastitis. And today we're going to have Rob DeClue, the district conservationist with the Soil and Water Conservation District of Chenango County. He's going to be interviewing Andy Bartlett, and Andy and his wife Maureen live on a farm here in Pharsalia in northern Chenango County. It's a former dairy farm and is currently being used for contract beef grazing.
This laneway was built up with shale a number of years ago, and it helped a lot, but animals will tend to make a groove, and they tend to create a berm too on the outside edges of your laneways, and that traps the water in. So,
what kind of numbers of cows were you using on the laneway?
We had about 140 milkers that were traveling up and down the laneways, and then smaller groups of dry cows and heifers.
As far as your laneways, in terms of accommodations, I mean, your laneways, are they strictly for livestock traffic, or
Yes.
do you use them for field equipment passage?
I've never liked trying to use them for field equipment.
So essentially to manage your grazing acreage in terms of equipment, either your own farm equipment or say fertilizer, lime spreads, stuff like that, you have alternate approaches that those pieces of machinery can get to.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rob. I mean, you really do need to be thinking about the fact that you are going to have to get equipment in to, at a bare minimum, clip your pastures, and you need to set your pastures up and your laneways up so that you can, at the very minimum, cut through. Like over there, there's a series of 2 spring gates in a row. That's how we access this system for either top dressing, or if we have to take surplus hay off, but the equipment isn't traveling in it. It's more just you've got to remember to think through that if equipment's going to get into the pasture, it's got to cut across laneways. So you got to, you got to think that through and stuff. Today's equipment's big, so you got to leave room for it. Be able to get in there.
So really kind of thinking through well ahead of the actual development or improvement of the laneway, what's going to have to cross the laneway or go down the laneway, what's the width of the equipment, things of that come into play in terms of making sure you don't have to undo or redo. So now you've got beef animals, has there been a difference in strategy and usage of the laneway?
Absolutely. Yeah, there really has been. In fact, strangely enough, I find myself grazing the place almost backwards because the cows don't need to come to the barn every day. So for instance, in the paddocks that are over there to the west, I graze them the way I used to in the first set of paddocks, and then I open a gate and graze them back this way because I like to just, keep them moving, but not there wouldn't be any sense in making them negotiate a series of laneways when there's no reason to.
As far as gates, I mean, I think you've touched on it a little bit, but we get questions from farmers like, well, where do I put the gates, and how wide and stuff like that. Can you kind of share with us what your thought process and how you've basically planned and actually installed gates along your laneways?
Sure. A couple basic things. Animals will concentrate in corners because they don't have any choice. I mean, here's a pinch point right here, and you kind of want to be trying to think how you're going to use the terrain. Typically, the dairy cattle would go out this way and come around that corner, so if I wanted to put heifers from this backgrounding lot in with the dairy, I needed an exit for them over there. Or if they wanted to go this way, I needed an exit point over here. It's very hard to take animals and encourage them to go out one way when they see the rest of their herd going another. It's like pushing water uphill. So the more you can get used to that kind of thing, the better. And in the worst case scenario, make an extra opening. I mean, you can always change your mind later and use it. If you don't need to use it, fine, but awful nice to have it there the day you need it rather than trying to build it that morning or something else.
What about widths? You know, again, this is one of those questions that get posed to people from farmers a lot of times is, well, how wide does a laneway have to be for my size operation, the type of critters that I'm working with? Do you have any insight on that?
Great question. I think wider is better, but of course you're eating up space with a laneway, the wider it is.
As far as the type of fence along the sides of the laneway, again, I see you've got, in some areas, you got one strand, and other areas you got 3 strands, and probably variations throughout the farm. I mean, any thoughts on the type and
species again? You know, crucial. I am a believer that to some extent you get a visual barrier out of 3 wires or so when the animals are in a tighter spot. But really, most of our fence is single wire now. That we've done all this stuff with laneways and fenced in more ground.
As far as the steepness of any of the reaches of laneways, you know, have you had any problems with, say, excessive wearing or erosion or gulling or anything like that?
We've got a spot that we tried to use as much of the field as we could over here, and it slopes off sharply to the road. And what happened over time, especially with the dairy cattle traffic, was so intense that they actually eroded it and built up a kind of a berm of laneway material that's actually raised the outer edge of the lane so that it's now a fence about that high. We should have been a little less conscious of the amount of field we were losing to the laneway and just backed up this way a little bit. But steepness is something that I really think you really overall got to avoid it, especially when you start talking about daily traffic of dairy animals.
As far as when talking about water, stream crossings, I mean, any of the laneways, do they cross any kind of a watercourse stream or whatever?
And we did a lot of work with a stream crossing in this direction and a smaller stream crossing in this direction, and it made a big difference, I think, in terms of water quality. We'd get high water, and we had times when we couldn't move cattle over to the east because the creek was too high. So yeah, you got to think about that, you know. I mean, and those are projects that you need help on that. I mean, that was earth moving and culverts and.
So these crossings that you're describing, the improvements you made, they're basically what we might call above grade crossings. The animals don't have to actually put their feet in the water
Correct.
course.
Yeah, they don't touch the water.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned another aspect of the laneway development here in terms of what I call water flow, and basically as you improve or position the laneways, you know, trying to accommodate, you know, surface water flow in such a way that it doesn't create headaches for you as well as the livestock. And so I think you mentioned like a culvert and stuff like that.
There's a big culvert underneath that assembly over there. It drains a brook that flows underneath the road and goes around through there. So we don't have a pinch point there at that water flow. The animals cross nicely there and move along.
Now, another aspect seems to be the final surface texture that you have on the laneways. Can you describe the different reaches, what kind of material that you've had? You mentioned shale at the first site where we were taping.
Yeah, we brought in some shale up there, and there's some shale underneath some of this bank run gravel that's in some of the high concentration places. Outside of a few spots on the farm, we really haven't done much with resurfacing the laneways. It's pretty much just native. The cattle turn it into native hardpan pretty quickly. And so again, you know, you have to use your head, not trying to use the worst areas at the worst possible times, and sometimes changing areas to get away from the cattle starting to show refusal to move or really slowing down and bogging down your efficiency.
So if I understand correctly, you brought in or imported material on site to build up and harden those laneways in the reaches that are most intensively used.
Right.
And then further out where the traffic isn't as frequently, intense and stuff
Right.
like that, you've been able to use basically the native material on site.
Right.
Okay. The final point that I might ask you is, besides your experience, what sources of information or technical assistance or cost-sharing opportunities have you utilized over the years to get where you are today?
Talking to other producers, going to visiting places is crucial. Sometimes you realize you know more than someone else, and sometimes you really get an eye-opening experience. And seeing the way different people have approached things it's invaluable.
Kind of like finding a golden nugget of somebody else's operation that you
Right.
can bring back home
Yep.
and apply.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing, your experiences here and taking the time to host our little taping.
Absolutely.
We appreciate it.
No
Thank you.
problem at all.